now. I am so happy to have with us today for our final Pressing Matters lecture of the semester, Dr. Daphne Brooks, who is a distinguished professor of African American Studies at Yale, an award-winning scholar of African American literary and cultural production in the 19th and 20th centuries. Dr. Brooks' new monograph, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, just came out from Harvard in 2021. And I have been told that her book, her work is on the syllabus of at least 4 different courses being offered at Stony Brook University this semester. And that makes me really happy because this series was designed as a way to increase. I think we came up with it kind of just as Zoom was taking over our lives. And we were really concerned that our students understand how important the arts and humanities are to the pressing issues of our time. And so this was designed to feature some of the leading thinkers, artists, musicians, activists that our students were studying in their classes, and to enable the students to have conversations with the figures that they were studying and to have that chance to talk back. And so I do want to express my gratitude to Professor Ben Tausig, Associate Professor of Music, who is the one who invited Professor Brooks to be with us today. And now I want to turn things over to Professor Maggie Adams, another Associate Professor in Music, who, along with several students, will be leading our conversation today with Dr. Brooks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for to the Humanities Institute for hosting, and especially thanks so much to our speaker. We are very fortunate to have joining us today Professor Daphne Brooks, whose work of the past 15 years has been so influential in how we think about race and performance in musicology and critical music studies. Dr. Brooks's work has helped us understand how Black performance, ethnography, criticism, and scholarship can constitute both dissent and also an aspect of temporal shifting, a reimagining, and through this reimagining, a reconstitution of what is possible. I'm now going to pass the ball to our brilliant new faculty member in the Stony Brook Music Department. He is assistant professor here at Stony Brook and is also a recipient of the prestigious 2021 inaugural Cleveland Institute of Music's Future of Music Faculty Fellowship, Dr. Kevin Holt.
Thank you for that. What can I say? It's an honor to introduce Dr. Daphne A. Brooks this evening for numerous reasons that speak to the enormity of her contribution to our understandings of race, class, gender, time, and the sonic phenomena that bind them through affect. But one reason I'm especially thankful is because years ago, in my first semester of graduate school, it was Professor Brooks's course centered on Black feminist musical subcultures that I first began thinking seriously about what it meant in both rigor and care to engage popular music academically. In fact, pretty much everybody in that course is extending a spark gathered from that experience into new lines of research, praxis, or art today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the enormity of Daphne Brooks' impact. Her work stands at the nexus of many fields and manages to transform all by inviting us to center under-acknowledged or too often wholly unacknowledged experiences that thrive in the ephemera of the spectacular and the mundane. I won't spend too much time gushing. But suffice it to say, Daphne Brooks's words, theorizations, frames, syntax, by the way, her writing is just beautiful, which is why I threw in syntax. It does work on its own. They all engage in difficult and transformative work. And it's truly a gift to have her here with us today as we think through the latest written addition to her remarkable and growing legacy. So I am excited to hear what comes next. And with that, I will pass it on to Hannah.
Hi, thank you. Our guest today, Professor Daphne Brooks, is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University, and also the Director of Graduate Studies in African American Studies at Yale. She is the author of Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, from Duke University Press in 2006, which won the Errol Hill Award for Outstanding Scholarship on African American Performance. She's also the author of Jeff Buckley's Grace and her most recent monograph, which we are focusing on particularly today, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, released in February of this year with Harvard University Press. Brooks has authored numerous articles on race, gender, performance, and popular music culture, such as Sister, Can You Line It Out?, Zora Neale Hurston, and the Sound of Angular Black Womanhood. And she has served as editor for numerous collected works and series. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, and The Guardian, among others. Brooks is currently editing an anthology of essays forthcoming from Duke University Press and culled from Black Star Rising in the Purple Rain, celebrating the legacies of David Bowie and Prince, an international 3-day conference and concert which she curated. In Liner Notes for the Revolution, Dr. Brooks hits the archives to engage the Black women who sang, collected, and wrote about the blues and other music genres in the 20th century and beyond, in order to show that these women's cultural work lies at the heart of American popular culture. In her archival work, Dr. Brooks resists at every turn the impulse to, quote, romance the stone, that is, to extract and exalt a frozen, timeless image of a person from the past, severed from their world. Rather, steeped in the rich theory of Black, feminist, and queer studies, Liner Notes for the Revolution introduces its readers to historical figures as complex people embedded in complex communities. Dr. Brooks uniquely organizes Liner Notes for the Revolution analogously to the vinyl records that populate its pages. Side A brings fresh insights to well-documented women, such as Zora Neale Hurston and Lorraine Hansberry. Side B digs deep into the archives for faded photographs, lost 78s, and other quotidian ephemera. In other words, for traces of the embodied relationships that everyday women had with and around music. Philosopher Fred Moten writes that, quote, for Daphne Brooks, Black feminist sound is sensuous thought. In Liner Notes for the Revolution, she feels and shows and says this with such devotion, such critical and emotional intelligence, such archival commitment and dexterity, and such urgent social aspiration that listening itself is new again, end quote. Here, Dr. Brooks provides many novel ways of knowing music history, including art making and bodily experiences that traditional accounts might leave out. For example, Dr. Brooks highlights moments when her historical interlocutors use music making to build worldviews or philosophies, and notes when interlocutors describe feelings like pleasure in their writing. Brooks highlights the ways in which the method she proposes addresses silence, currently in the archive, by opening up the possibility of telling stories of people whose lives are not contained in written records. As such, Liner Notes for the Revolution is a compelling demonstration of the urgent need for bringing the insights of Black studies to both blues criticism and American popular music studies more broadly, made all the more urgent by the long history of white supremacist patriarchy in university music curricula. We are so grateful to Dr. Brooks, both for her remarkable scholarship and for being here today. Thank you. I'll pass it back over to Maggie now.
That was Hannah Waterman, Stony Brook graduate student in critical music studies. Thanks so much for that introduction to Dr. Brooks and her new book. We have engaged with this book in two seminars, at least two seminars, and in our undergraduate classes this semester in the music department. And we have many questions for Dr. Brooks. So if Professor Brooks is ready for it, we'll start right off with the questions.
Could I have a moment just to pause on what an extraordinary string of introductions just filled the Zoom room? I am so moved and so grateful. And from everyone from Susan Shuckle to Adrian with the administrative support to Kevin Holt just blowing my mind, seeing Professor Holt here, to Michael and Maggie, to Hannah for giving me an introduction by way of that book that allows me to hear my book in 3 different kinds of stereophonic thought. I'm just blown away. So I'm incredibly moved, and thank you. And now I will be quiet.
Okay, thanks, Sue. It's great to hear your voice. We'll hear more of it later. So our first question is by a student in my Music 537, which is an ethnography class, Octavio De Lucci. And his question, regarding the Delta Blues section and its treasure hunt work, the search for the lost ark or the lost archives, Black women's music and its generations. Can you comment on that treasure hunt aspect of this kind of work?
Thank you, Octavio, for that question. It's a really powerful question since it actually takes me back to the sociality of the intellectual worlds that I was trying to document in this text, especially in the side B portion of the study. And some of what ended up on the cutting room floor had to do directly with the kinds of debates about the mythos and fetishizations, fetishistic pursuits of objects that you've aptly identified as the treasure hunt impulse in blues criticism and critical worlds. And so without naming names, although I'm named names in the book, one of my interlocutors who I had to get permission in order to include his email exchange in the book, he and I had a kind of turning point in what was a 2-hour conversation that included a pina colada for me in one hand. It was about an hour after I'd finished delivering my weekly lecture and protest music that in the fall of 2020. And we were at a point where he'd agreed to let me include the email in the book. But he said to me as we were about to part, he said, I just feel like it's really important to pursue these figures who are lost to us, because you never know when we might be missing someone who invented calculus. And I paused and I said to him, and I said with a kind of ethical generosity that I hope comes out in the book, because this is a shared endeavor to figure out how we handle the history that we inherit and that constitutes our intellectual worlds, our material worlds. I said to him, but fill in the blank, what about the multitudes who didn't invent calculus? Don't they matter as well? How do we account for them in our work? Don't they participate in this shared kind of cultural and aesthetic life world? Can we get beyond the exceptional in order to think about the ways in which our communal, artistic, and sonic lives are informed by collaboration and a range of networks of intimacies? And I'll leave it there rather than getting into his response. But I hope that begins to answer your question about how I was thinking about the problems of the treasure hunt and how to try to work through that kind of a problem. Thanks for your question.
The next question is from Marty Eisenberg, also from my seminar. He says, I love how your book sometimes blurred the lines between musicologist, critic, and artist. I had always thought of these roles as separate, but I see now they are not. Do you think being an artist makes one a better critic?
No, thanks, Marty. How great are these questions? it makes you a different critic for sure. Yeah, I was very committed in this book to paying close attention to the ways in which artists are not only, of course, capable of producing knowledge about their own work and about the work of others, but about the importance of recognizing the multiplicity of ways that they produce knowledge about their own work and the work of others. And so to the extent that the music is and the performances, the extended, repertoire performances attached to, entangled with the music, are sites of knowledge production. I think that they do, they yield a particular kind of critical vantage point that I would love for our next generation of thinkers to continue to theorize. Whether or not it's better or not, I'm not sure, but it's distinct and it's rich, and we have so much work to do to be able to track on that. So thank you for that question, Marty.
Michael, I think you're up.
Okay. So the next question is mine, and I'm not in any of these seminars, but I began and I'm the co-moderator of an unofficial music department graduate reading group, Adorno Pizza and Beer, or APB.
I love it.
It focuses on connecting music to cultural studies and critical theory and philosophy, and very with low stakes, or in a very casual environment. But we've been also reading through the book, and Hannah is co-moderator with me. But so my question is, in your chapter on Rosetta Writes, you write about the emphasis on virtuosity in her music criticism, and specifically virtuosity as Thomas Carson Mark describes it. And that is a work which foregrounds skill and also, quote, stands as an instance of what it is about, end quote. So I'm curious as to if the concept of virtuosity similarly loomed large in the process of writing this book, and if you see the book itself and the style and the choice of subjects and individuals and ideas as a kind of actualization or realization of the things you write about.
Such a great question. Thank you, Michael. And I hope that I thanked both you and Maggie for leading this conversation. I can't remember, there was such an all-star cast of people who framed our entrance into this event. So thank you again. Yeah, I mean, I was very much inspired to think about the levels of formalistic invention that one can track on in traditions of Black performance and cultures of Black performance. I was very much inspired by Albert Murray's theories of improvisation, and I bring up his, famous canonical piece in improvisation and the creative process, which came about through Bob Mealy's history-making jazz and American culture event in the late 90s that became a germinal volume. And in Murray's lecture turned essay, he talks really beautifully about improvisation and mastery as analogous to playing jacks, which I always sucked at when I was a child, but being able to kind of increase your ability. I think that the Gen Z translation of this in gaming culture would be just online gaming culture, to be able to increase the ability of intensity and challenge in order to mark some kind of control and affirmation of one's own performance abilities. And I think about that a lot with relation to the figures in the book. But formalistically for this text, for this study, I think and actually I'll say methodologically too, that I was more interested in, on my own terms as a scholar, in paying attention to failure as opposed to virtuosity. Or maybe we should be having a conversation about the relationship between failure and virtuosity. I would love for people to help me think about that. My colleagues in queer theory, my dear friend Jack Halberstam and others have written really brilliantly about what failure can yield, Heather Love, in terms of thinking about an alternative to, hegemonic ways of being in the world. And so to a certain extent, this is a volume that is aspiring towards trying to document and honor the scale of what I feel and others of my generation feel has been intellectually missed with regards to Black women's genius in sonic cultures. But it's also, I hope people are tracking on me trying to constantly acknowledge that I'm mindful of the fact that there's always going to be a level of failure in being able to capture these things that we have lost as a result of racial catastrophe and racial capitalism. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I felt inspired to answer that.
I thought that was a perfect answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a great question. Great questions, you guys. Wow. Why don't I have a pina colada right now? So much more enjoyable than that conversation with that person. Whatever. I mean,
Feel free if you need a minute.
I mean, I will say I want all the questions, but if people are interested in talking more about, ethics and collegiality, that is certainly something that I try to write about it and through in the book. And my citational practice is very much informed by this idea of resisting the romance of the auteur figure who is Critic, and calling attention to the ways that conversations with and intellectual intimacies and engagements with our colleagues, our students, our mentors is how we produce our work in the first place. And I wanted to lay that bare, even when it's a struggle. The grad class I'm teaching right now is called The Beautiful Struggle, which is from the book itself and inspired by Saidiya Hartman's work, The Beautiful Struggle, Blackness, the Archive, and the Speculative. And my students are constantly, whatever, I don't know. Do I want to finish that sentence? It's a struggle. We're having a struggle because I'm trying to, just kind of pull back the curtain of, how we do the work we do in academia, and to really sit with things that are hard and to not always have the answers. So.
Great. So our next question is from Jung-Yi Ho, and he asks, what's your opinion on the Harlem Renaissance? Was modernizing for minorities, as he calls it, inevitably being whitened?
Oh, thank you for that question. I want to make sure that I'm understanding it. So the question is the ways in which the Harlem Renaissance as an historical moment has been potentially appropriated and oversimplified with regards to its complexities, its contributions to our ideas about modern culture and modernity more broadly. Is that the question, Jenny? Did I get it right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Great, thank you so much. That's a really important question. And I do think that, my work has been inspired by folks like the not too in the far off distance, sadly departed Cheryl Wall, Black feminist, literary and culture critic, who wrote extensively about Black women in the Harlem Renaissance. Her last book was about Ralph Ellison's essays and his aesthetics and theories bound up in the essay form. I actually saw her in January of 2020 at the MLA in Seattle. So I'm referencing Cheryl Wall and kind of lingering on her because I think that her work taught me so much, and my generation of scholars so much, about trying to piece together entire life worlds of those figures from the Harlem Renaissance who were invested in, leading deeply complicated lives in the interwar period and in the context of Jim Crow that resist the kinds of sometimes two-dimensional ways that we think about the figure of the new Negro, quote unquote. And I certainly was trying to do that or pursue that way of approaching writing about Zora Neale Hurston as a sound ethnographer, trying to lay a claim to understanding her kind of intellectual battles, some of which are well known, some of which not as well known, with folks like Lomax, Herbert Halbert, and others. As far as the whitewashing goes, I guess I just want to emphasize that in Black studies, we are constantly trying to push back against these simplistic ways of understanding that moment in African-American cultural history and literary history. And so another figure who's been very important to my thinking about that time period is Farah Jasmine Griffin, the great Farah Jasmine Griffin. Her book, Who Set You Flowin', the African-American Migration Narrative, she kind of gives you this sort of micro history of the Great Migration through different literary moments. And that served, I think, as this necessary scaffolding for something like Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. So we need to keep doing the kind of work that pays attention to the quotidian, the everyday ways that artists from that period were living their lives and producing their work. Thanks for that question. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Christine, I think you're, oh no, I'm Christine. I'm Christine today. So this is a question from Christine Pash in Kevin's Music 536 class. And she asks, you frequently discuss your historical women's musical and music writing practices in terms of pleasure and in terms of navigating oppressive circumstances. How do you see self-care working here, if that is a compelling concept? She continues, how do you think through ideas of labor versus rest, taking a break, and if applicable, self-care when it comes to making, quote, making the modern world, and when it comes to the social leisure moments you discuss in chapter 6?
Yeah, oh my God. That is fantastic. First of all, lucky you got to be in Kevin Holt's class. Thank you, Christine. I got very excited about answering the first part of the question because I do think that, I sort of subconsciously was trying to manifest in the form and the content of the book a way in which to think about a kind of Black feminist care that operates in the context of the intellectual. And again, my Black feminist mentors, like the late great Barbara Christian, like President Val Smith, who's president of Swarthmore, like Farah Griffin, Stia Hartman, et cetera, there's a way that their scholarship is about conducting care with regards to looking after, to use my dear close friend and brilliant genius, Black feminist queer studies scholar, Kara Keeling's formulation, to look after these figures in the archive and history, both at the center and at the margins, and to be able to show them care through our scholarship. But the thing that I don't often talk about, and I hope it's in the book, is that it is a kind of self-care. So thank you, Christine, for even bringing that formulation up. Because I've always gotten so much pleasure out of both writing and reading. And, Toni Morrison, who's a huge figure in the book, who was a huge figure in my intellectual life and also my professional life and the years that I taught at Princeton that overlapped with her. Her last collection of essays is called The Source of Self-Regard. And so I do think it is so crucial for those of us in marginalized communities to really hold on to and linger on the ways in which our intellectual work is a kind of self-regard, and that is its own form of care. So thank you. That's just, you've helped me to think more about that. And then those tensions between labor, or maybe it's not even tensions, but the dialectic between labor and rest. That's beautiful. I obviously prioritized a kind of way of highlighting the work of caring for and looking after Black women's sonic cultures. At one point, the subtitle of this book was the intellectual life and labor of Black feminist thinkers, or something like that, which my press was like, let's not do that. But labor is a recurring kind of trope. And, you know, I think maybe the entanglements here are that you do a certain kind of intellectual and scholarly labor of documenting the kind of radical forms of rest that, in the case of my study, can emerge by way of pleasure and enjoyment, you know, with the sonic cosmos. And so they're intricately and inextricably linked to one another. That's wonderful. I would love to see a project that is about that, not necessarily about my work, but thinking more about this. There's the entanglements of labor and rest in popular music culture. Go for it, please. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thanks so much. And so now we have a question from Jeremy Carlstead. He asks, considering some of the recent appointments, such as Nicole Mitchell as a director of University of Pittsburgh's Jazz Studies program, and Regina Carter as director of NGPAC's Summer Jazz Residency, do you feel like education has made any significant progress in regard to making women, and Black women in particular, a prominent part of these type of programs? What can be done in our immediate future to expand on this?
Wow, Jeremy. Look at you guys. This is just like, what a dream to be in conversation with you all. I'm jealous. You guys get to do this all the time with each other. That's a great question. And I'm thinking, in addition to that marvelous lineup that you just identified, somebody like Terry Lynn Carrington, who oversees, particular line of educational programming at Berkeley School of Music, and, is on the faculty there. The way that I'm, your question is helping me to think more about the parallels between the longstanding presence and centrality of African-American women in the classroom, and also in relation to music education. The first person who really got me to thinking about this was the GOAT historian, Robin Kelly, who, when he was finishing up his mammoth tome of a masterpiece on Monk, was giving a talk at Harvard, and I was present for it. And we had a conversation afterwards where he was saying, well, the thing that I kept coming back to is, this long tradition of Black women as piano teachers, and how we don't really have a history of that. And then now we have Kira Thurman, the another just extraordinary genius, scholar of Black classical music. She has a new book that just dropped this fall. You all are probably already familiar with, Singing Like Germans, in which she really tracks on kind of the role of education in relation to classical music culture and African-American uplift projects. And now I'm trying to find my way back to Jeremy's question. This was really kind of the deep improvisational rift. Can you remind me of the contours of the question again? Because it was so rich.
Sorry, finding my way back to. Do you feel like education has made any significant progress in regard to making women and Black women in particular?
Right. Yeah.
What further can we do to?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So maybe one way that we could take this, to continue to extend the life of this legacy is to actually have more critical studies about the longstanding, role of Black women in relation to music education. I'm giving you all projects to take on, to keep building the field. So thank you for that, Jeremy. That's such an important point to bring up. and is true too in, something like Ralph Ellison's biography, which I talk a little bit about, how important a whole range of women, but especially, of course, Hazel at Tuskegee, a whole range of women instructors were to his kind of, not only the nature of his pedagogy and training as a musician, as a trumpeter, but also just how he kind of thought about the ethics of Black music and resistance projects and uplift. So thank you.
Hi. So throughout the book, you cultivate such beautiful relationships with your interlocutors, whether people that you've met and conversed with or people that you've encountered in the archives. And I was wondering how your relationship with the writers and musicians that you cover developed as you researched and wrote your book, and what it was like to put such a close and intimate relationship on the page.
Oh, Hannah, thank you so much for that question. And thank you again for just such an extraordinary overview of my book. I actually want you to rewrite my book because you know it better than I do. I appreciate that question quite a bit. I mean, I led early on by talking about the sometimes fraught and complicated conversations I've had with one interlocutor whose work I actually I value quite a bit. But this is a little bit of a sidebar before getting to the heart of your question. I think it was a startling experience for some of the critics who I write about who are still with us. A couple of the villains, I do call them villains. They're just straight Jim Crow villains. They've passed on. But some of the folks were startled to be a part of the narrative. And I wanted to make it clear that it was important to me to call attention to my own role, right, in the narrative and theirs too, that, when we're writing about music and when we're writing about cultural objects, or, fields of study that we are drawn to, we are there, no matter what, kind of conventional scholarly life has told us in the past. And so how do we handle the fact that we're always there? We're always in the room with the objects that we're working on, the problems that we're wrestling with. With the musicians, the way that those conversations came about, deeply serendipitous. I have a working group here at Yale with my brilliant colleague in music, the great Brian Kane. And we received a grant not long after I joined the faculty at Yale in 2014 to start a working group called Black Sound in the Archive. And it's referenced specifically in the footnotes in the book. And it just so happened that I had my top 3 figures I wanted to invite, well, 4, because the great and dear Jason Moran, we were definitely going to invite as well. And I adore him. But there were 3 artists, Cecile Baclair and Sylvant, Rihanna Giddens, and Valerie June, who I just knew I wanted to include in our programming series. At the time, and I think some people might not believe me, but I wasn't sure that I was actually going to include the conversations that unfolded during their visits to campus in the book. But the programs that we curated were so rich as, part public listening sessions, part workshops about their craft, that, it was just a boon for me. And I will say that of the 3, I'm not going to name names. One has become just somebody quite dear to me, who I continue to think alongside of about archival issues. One also incredibly generous, and I haven't had as many post-visit conversations with her, but has been continuing to do things out in the world that we've been able to communicate about and bond over. And one is a little bit thorny and prickly. I'll just leave it. And I have no idea how she feels about the book. She was very, she gave of her time in really generous ways when she came to Yale, but I have not had much conversation with her since then. I'll say that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so this is my second question. I feel like it's kind of been in in the room for, the whole time in a way. And it's so towards the beginning of part B in the book, you mentioned strategizing a politics of care when it comes to doing work in and with the archive. And I adore this. And so really, I just want to ask what you believe such a politics of care might look like, or is perhaps already beginning to look like. I feel like there's certainly the thumbprint of this compassion throughout the book.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I mean, my answer, I think, would be inspired by the way that Hannah put it in her introduction. And that is that I did feel that at least my strategy of care was to try to replace some of these figures who've been, let's just go with it, with ripped from their communities by way of the scholarship of others. I wanted to rebuild and at least hold a space for trying to question and imagine all of the different ways that community informed who they became as musicians, or the ways that they maybe had, complicated relationships to their communities. But that felt like an ethical project. And by way of doing that, caring for the complexities of African American history more broadly. So I think there are a lot of different ways to think about that. I mean, my mother is as a figure in the second half of the book. She's 95 in California, knock on wood. And, I think going back to the idea about self-care, I needed to pay attention to who I have become as a scholar, and I had to be able to trace those lifelines back to, it had to be a genealogical endeavor as well. If I was going to think very broadly about how I've received this history in my own place in history, I had to care for all of the people in my own community as well. And that's family, that's students, that's mentors, that's other critics who've taught me things, that's other critics who I've, fought with. But I wanted to be respectful of all of those different kinds of intimacies. I think we lose track of that sometimes in academia, our connections to others and our connections to the objects that we care about. So trying to handle all of that is a challenge, but I think that I hope that it will continue to yield just very rich scholarship from, this next generation of scholars, from all of you.
The next question is a bit of a kind of departure, taking a little bit of a turn here. Marty Eisenberg again writes, because of the prevalence of streaming, liner notes are no longer as big a part of the artifact of an album.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel like this is a disservice to music fans?
I mean, you don't ever want to be the old craggy, the crank in the room. I think it's unfortunate. It doesn't mean, though, that knowledge isn't still being produced about music, but how we circulate it and who has access to it is always going to be a question. And in many ways, the liner notes, was such a rarefied form to the extent that, people who maybe didn't have access to the material objects, who lived their lives in relation to music through radio, who couldn't afford, purchasing vinyl, might have, less of an ability to engage in those kinds of critical conversations emerging out of liner notes as well. So I think maybe the way that I think about it now is what is going to be the next form that either revives the liner note genre or does a similar kind of work to liner notes that is generative and inspiring and capable of cultivating conversations and connections between fans and critics and the music. Thanks for that question, Marty.
So just to let you know, we are going to open this up to general questions from all of you here. I'll probably just do one or two more questions, and then I'll open it up. So start thinking about what you want to ask. So our next question is from Christine Pash. She says, I learned a lot from your use of ideas like body as archive and music making as theory that go beyond many current Western academic ways of producing knowledge. Do you have visions, plans, dreams, etc., for future methods beyond the ones you mentioned in liner notes of presenting or curating US popular music history and especially Black women's roles therein? Have you imagined something like liner notes existing in a format other than a book? If so, where, when, what, how?
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Christine. I mean, I want you all to come up with the ideas, right? This book is an invitation. I will say that so Sylvia Spitza is a Dartmouth scholar whose work is really important in the Romancing the Stone section of the book in terms of thinking about the stillness of the presumed stillness of indigenous figures in photographs, of hegemonic photographs. That Sylvia Letha, I've never met Sylvia Letha, but I know that she's engaged in some public humanities projects wherein people gather together in order to handle and share and care for and look after these photographs in a different context than in the often stultifying and violent conditions of the archive. And I have certainly tried to curate, along with my colleague Brian Kane, these kind of public spaces, inspired, I should say, early on by a fantastic invitation that I got to participate in a public program on the event of the first release of the Paramount Records first volume archive. And the musician Jack White and other figures, Grail Marcus, were there at the New York Public Library. And then we did the second release at Yale. And that event was really designed to be able to play the music in a way that, for me, later was resonant with what Sylvia Letha has been doing with the photographs. To be able to hold the music at the center of our kind of collective imagination, and to think communally about the kind of knowledge and, affective and otherwise, that we can generate about the object together. Adam Driver, never thought I would bring up Adam Driver, but last night he was on Colbert talking about his military theater project, and he had just this great little line about thinking about the collective intelligence of the audience, which I thought I'm going to steal and cite Adam Driver, because I really do believe that and feel excited about the kind of work that we can do as an ensemble, to cite my dear friend Fred Moden, to care for this music and to care for, or any kind of music, to care for these objects that have all sorts of resonances in our everyday worlds and in our scholarly worlds. So maybe liner notes, another form of liner notes, come out of that. Maybe these kinds of events that I would encourage everyone to imagine can happen at the communal level in a way that allows us to continue to promote the idea of scholarly questions and intellectual questions being able to exist and circulate outside of the confines of the academy. That's not exactly what you were asking me, Christine, but I hope that it gets close to at least some of the ideas. Oh yeah, you want to know about another method, and come back to me on that. Maybe we can collaborate on that. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, this answered everything, and I'm very excited to find out more about the event that you are already having with Brian King.
Absolutely, yes. It's called Black Sound in the Archive. I can throw the link into the chat. I also should say, as a sidebar, we should have included in the book that there's a 9-hour Spotify playlist that accompanies the book. I don't know if people found that. I see Hannah going, I know, we should have, it's so dumb. I should have put it in the author's note. I forgot. And all thanks to my research assistants, to Amy Dupoy and Von Trong for putting that together. And it's just called Liner Notes for the Revolutions on Spotify. I can pull them both up.
Okay, while you were
Mhm.
doing that, I think maybe what we'll do is we'll open it up to questions and we can come back to our list of prepared questions if we need to. I think the best way to do this is to either raise your real hand or your, little emoji person hand, and we'll take them as they come. So I see Ben Tausig has his hand up. Ben, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Daphne.
And
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the publics that you imagined being readers or recipients otherwise of the knowledge in this book, both as you conceived it, as you wrote it, and now that it's out in the world?
Thank you, Ben. I hope I thanked you as well. I was trying to thank everybody. Thank you for extending the invite for me to be here for this just extraordinary event. I've long had just all sorts of fraught relations with multiple publics regarding the form of my writing and my writerly voice. And even though they've been fraught relations, they've, I think, yielded really important experiments and have pushed me even further to just see what's possible in terms of who I can reach in my writing. I felt and have felt for a long time with writing about popular music culture that I wanted to be able to draw on all of the different kinds of knowledges that have informed my experiences with popular music culture. And that means everything from Black feminist thought to, of course, rock music criticism, which I write about extensively in the book, and which had a really important place in my life when I was a teenager, kind of figuring out my conversations with the popular. And that form of writing, as I discuss in the book, is so distinct in terms of its kind of spectacular convictions, its hubris, its eccentricities. I wanted to be able to claim that as my own, and yet infuse it with a kind of Black feminist praxis and ethics, and yoke that together as well with my training in literary studies and cultural theory and African American history in a way that was heterogeneous. And so to that extent, I wanted to be able to reach all of the publics all at once who were aligned with one or more of those kinds of, critical lexicons. And that meant, having to walk a tightrope, cite Janelle Monáe there. I've had in the past, and I've talked about this with junior colleagues early on, especially before tenure, I got quite a bit of this is too academic if I was writing for the popular press, or this isn't academic enough. And then I had somebody who said to me once, he was an editor of a scholarly journal, I think you're all style and no substance. And I said, what if the style is the substance, dude? Right? So, I thought that was a really generative exchange, even though he was an asshole. Pardon my French. With this book, I wanted to be able to have rock music criticism be able to acknowledge how important African American intellectual communities are to the work that they do, even though they don't know it. And the trickier side, which Farrah Griffin and Gail Wald often push me on, is why should Black studies care about rock music criticism? And, what I tried to respond to was the very fact that the hubris and the eccentricity and the kind of deep unapologetics, our kids like to use that word a lot, but conviction of ideas is something that I want us to be able to hold on to in our work, but to not be assholes about it. So let's try and find the ethical way of doing all of that. So I wanted everybody in the room. Also, as the youngest child in a very much older family, which I write a little bit about in the book, I'm prone to loneliness. And so I wanted everybody there. I want to figure out how to write to everybody. So maybe I did that. We'll see.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
I think our next person is Lorenzo Simpson.
Okay. Hi, yeah, I was actually fortunate enough to be at one of the performances for the Black Sound in the Archive, the Brianna Giddens. So you really piqued my curiosity about which of the triumvirate gave you an issue. But that aside, what also intrigued me is an expression you used earlier, namely the expression that performance is a site of knowledge production.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could say more about that. What sort of knowledge specifically, or whatever you have to say about that. I'd be curious to hear about.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you for attending that event.
Yeah.
And let me emphasize, all three of those artists were just incredible and so generous with their time. And this book would be nothing without their participation in our program. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's I always think there's a multiplicity of knowledges we can extrapolate from performances, and we have to decide for ourselves as critics which are the ones that we want to really press on and pursue. And for me, I was fascinated by the idea of embodied knowledges. If we think about somebody like Cécile McLaurin-Salvant and the ways that her just astounding durational performance of Jelly Roll Morton's Murder Ballad had the ability to yield, a range of insights about, what the physical body is capable of in performance, the range of intricate and nuanced desires that are bound up in a song that, is often thought of as, one of the greatest and also most complicated, prison ballads that we have in the archive. What does it mean for a Black woman to be able to interpret that song and through repetition with a critical difference, enable us to hear a multiplicity of histories and critical vantage points within the performance? But I also think, right, and I see the instruments behind you, that we can learn so much, right, about the different ways that instruments, be it the voice or some other object that we're playing, we can learn so much about what the instrument is capable of. And in that sense, I think as performers, learn something about ourselves, how we handle those instruments. And that, I think, has, gives us a wide range of ways to think about our humanity, to think about how a particular text that's being interpreted by way of the performative body of the instrument is opened up through that interpretation. And also maybe something about the secrets of the instrument itself. So that's how I kind of think about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next up we have Shirley Lim.
Oh,
Hi, Shirley.
great.
Daphne, darling, how are you?
Great Shirley Lim. Come on.
I'm going to be a sonic experience because I'm using a computer where the camera doesn't work, but I somehow thought, wow, that's weirdly appropriate.
Sure.
And you've known what I've looked like for, what is it? Oh my God, Daphne, is it 3 decades?
Yeah. Yeah, 30 years.
Ah, it's been
Crazy.
a long time.
It's been a long time.
But one of the things I just really love about your written work and the way you present verbally is the way you really acknowledge Black feminist thought production as a communal process. And that is just so amazing to take it out of the realm of, the individualistic, neoliberal, and all of that stuff. But so my question actually, or something I actually wanted to hear from your perspective. So you've been, talking to lots of different audiences, you've been having conversations with all sorts of young people. And what I was hoping to hear is sort of your read on the various moods and politics of young, say, college age people. Because, I've been teaching things lately, like in the past week, stuff on the Black Panthers, all sorts of exciting, revolutionary stuff and about social change. And yet I talked to several of my undergraduates, when we're discussing these materials, and they feel, quite a few of them feel sort of helpless and hopeless in the face of just all the overwhelming problems. But then I look at you, Daphne, or I think about, where we are now, and I think, oh my God, but there's been so much change. There's been so many amazing ways that these ideas are coming forth, and they're very political ideas as well as aesthetic. So I wanted to get your sort of sense engaged, because I'm trying to, have some sort of hope for the future, right? Resources of hope, so to speak.
Ooh, yeah, Shirley. Wow, that's heavy. I mean, I know. I mean, I'm hopeful all the time when I'm in the classroom. I really am, and I think that often comes by way of, to go back to your initial point that you were raising, it comes by way of the extent to which my students see each other and feel that they need each other and are open to collaborating. And, to steal from Fred again, one of the things that what he said to us a few weeks after the 2016 election, when he came through, was, I've been thinking a lot about fellowship in relation to the classroom. And this comes up a lot in the work that he does with Stefano Harney and the Undercommons, and it's in the current trilogy. And it's actually infused in, jazz studies ethics. But the idea of the soloist being distinct from the self, right? That you're able to aestheticize and articulate your individuality, but in relation to a broader communal effort and ethos. And it's something that I try to center in the classroom, and I've known you long enough to believe that that's true for you as well. And it's where I see the hope. And it's also just kind of giving them the space to be able to claim that, to claim collaboration as being the way to reject the kind of neoliberal protocols of the university. And sometimes it takes dipping your toe, in the deep end and getting used to it, because a lot of them, when I give them, group projects for their end projects, will look up at me, and this has happened in the grad class too, in the Beautiful Struggle class, where they're partnering as duos and trios to take on an archival object and work together in creating a conversation about the object. Because the instinct is to do this kind of work, on your own, and to accrue a certain kind of definition of merit that's based on, singularized intellectual property. And so to decenter that is something that I think when we invite them to do that they, it yields some of the most exciting, examples of where the future is headed, both in the classroom and out of the classroom, that one can imagine. So I don't know if that answers your question, Shirley, but it's what you elicited by way of your question to me.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I'm actually making my students do what I'm calling, so they're writing a manifesto in small groups collectively, and they're going to put it together in what I'm calling sort of a patchwork quilt method.
That's great.
So,
come on. This is what we're talking about.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I'll try to, gauge where they are after they do this kind of communal political work together.
Awesome. Let me know how that goes. That is really fantastic.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Shirley. Say hi to Matt.
I will.
So do we have any other questions up now? If not, I think we have time for just one more. Give you a minute to think about it. Okay, I have one more question. This is a question from Octavio DeLucci. And he asks, how would Hurston and Wrights work in a way that we could do now? How can we reframe such work to nowadays and to fit as a part of our own work?
Oh, wow. God, what a great question. Wow. We need lots of little Hurstons. I mean, she was a handful. So, but also, in a contrarian, we need contrarians. But I think I mean that most pointedly in terms of thinking about folks who are willing to take on sonic projects that, both can utilize the tools of the documentarian, but also exceed the documentary impulse in order to yield, a variety of different ways of tracking on and looking after the history that we, that is all around us and that is so potently felt through sound. We need that. So I hope that that's happening with this next generation of scholars. And Wrights as well. I mean, Wrights is so interesting. And I love that question, what do we take from Rosetta Wrights to imagine what we can do with our next generation of work? And, somebody who's willing to think about independent record making, which obviously is very charged and has to take on a different kind of, well, does it? I don't know. It can take on a variety of different forms now, but someone who's willing to take on record making as not the be all endeavor in the context of popular music culture, but one of several different strategies designed to mark history and genius and excellence. So, Wrights started the label, but she also was writing liner notes in order to produce knowledge about the knowledge that she found in the music. So we need these kinds of multifaceted kinds of projects that I'm so excited to see what people do through digital platforms and otherwise, hopefully in person as well. If we can imagine, what the after times can look like, where we are, holding that musical history in our hands and caring for it through a variety of different aesthetic and intellectual practices. Yeah, that's a great question. That's so cool. All of the questions have been absolutely phenomenal. The best I've gotten, and I've done many events this year. I've been lucky to do many events. This has been really, really, really special.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to start. What a way to end this question and answer session. So thanks everybody for coming, and let's give a hand to
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.